We do have a bit of time for some reactions and comments before we move to the next set of presentations. And so I would like I have a few questions myself, but let's open the floor for any questions or comments, including among the panelists, presenters themselves. Peter.
Well, if I may just kick off the questions with your remark on China. I think it's very right that if you look on what you could call China's objective interests, certainly they should be for a proposal like this. But it's also fair to say that it's not on the agenda. It's not being pressed at any stage, at any point so far. And in a way, it's interesting that they're not pressing this, because if things are now developing the way we are seeing, then we might be seeing a market closure. I mean, we do have 2 panels running. We do have a lot of local content issues out there. And sooner rather than later, we could see that the global market could, little by little close down. So any reflections on your sides on how to get the Chinese on board on this, since it seems to be in their objective interests?
Okay, let's take one or two more, and then we'll have some responses. Yes.
Thank you very much to Ricardo and Gary for very interesting presentations. Maybe just one question, actually maybe two, but depending on their difficulty. I guess leaving out the services component was a necessary step to, I guess, getting a possible agreement off the ground in terms of realism. But could you comment on the implications of leaving out the services component? Is it just impossible to think of moving forward if that's there? It just becomes too politically difficult to imagine the trade-offs that would be necessary to actually move it forward. Is that the reason, I guess? And then the second question is, how difficult would it be after the initial tariff reduction to move towards the NTB component? Could you just comment on the degree of difficulty involved in the NTB reductions?
Klein?
Gary, just following up on that, I mean, all over Chinese solar, etc. I mean, there's a broad conceptual problem with it. Much of the world thinks there should be a shadow price on carbon, and one way to put that on is to subsidize production of energy. Then there's a block of the world that says the subsidy is applicable to trade laws. If so, some of those countries. Whether you can say something about that nexus.
Okay, let's get some reactions, comments, and then we'll come back for another round of questions and comments from the floor. Gary?
Thanks. Well, the Peter's comment and Bill Klein's comment both revolve rightly around China. Here's how I see a possibility, but it's only that. Why would China want to join an agreement like this? Well, it's clear that China will not be in the initial stages of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and it's also clear that the Chinese, if not the Americans, see the TPP as a matter of putting a ring around China. So China might conceivably want to join in some other agreement to make the ring not so tight, and also the United States might very much like to have China so as to diffuse this idea of a tight ring around China. And so the SETA might possibly be one way to have some positive engagement between the U.S. and China, and certainly other countries in China as well, on trade matters. That's kind of big global geopolitics. Very specifically, as was mentioned by Peter, there is this anti-dumping case and countervailing duty case. All cases of trade remedies have both heads. claimed by petitioners these days. And I'm going to throw out an idea which I think is a stretch and is as far as could be gone. I don't think the U.S. would be, I'm quite sure the U.S. would not be willing, for some of the reasons that Bill referenced, to foreclose or put a substantially higher injury test on anti-dumping and countervailing duty in the context of a SETA. What it might do is introduce a concept which has long been floating around in the trade community, but in this area might actually be possible, and that is have a balancing of interests, taking into account the renewable energy deployment and the jobs created by the deployment, and give those arguments, or the companies which represented those arguments, standing in a hearing. Now that's kind of revolutionary, but this might do it. And this goes very much to what Ricardo said. There's this conflict between, are using it to create jobs, whatever the cost, or using it to promote renewable energy as fast as possible. And I think there'll be a certain force, political force, to want to deploy renewable energy as fast as possible, especially given the huge cost differences which have been observed. So I could see that as a possibility, and that, I guess, in a way answers what Bill says. There is a fundamental conflict. Yeah, there's a fundamental conflict between doing renewable energy fast and our long-standing adherence to these anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws, which give quite a bit of protection, are the main form of protection now for industries which are facing serious serious import competition. Now, turning to what to Sherry's question about services, the problem in environmental goods and services discussion in the WTO, which is even more severe there than with the goods, on the services side, more severe than with the goods, is the definition, because it has to do with consulting services, engineering services, and so forth, which are very widely applicable not only to renewable energies or environment, but just broadly applicable. And that seemed to have created a lot of dissonance within the EGS group in terms of extending it to services. And in our paper, we were a little too optimistic on what the WTO has achieved, and Ricardo sent me a paper which is more realistic on how they're just totally stalled on the services side. So my great hope on services, once the WTO winds down the Doha round, is to have a services plurilateral with the same characteristics which I discussed, but not trying to do it on a line item basis, which is what a renewable energy services agreement would entail, but a much broader services plurilateral.
Well, thank you. I think I don't have much to add to this. This is the services issue. Is as Gary said, it's been a very steep learning curve in the WTO on environmental goods, but not quite the same on services. And so the last meeting and the CT on this was in 2010, and at that meeting, what was interesting is that several delegations, including developing country delegations, came up with sort of a request that the Secretariat started doing work on the definition and the inclusion of services related to renewable energies. In the renewable energy field, what I understand from Peter and others is that maintenance and operation services are a very big part of actually of the contracts, which are long-term contracts, and it's actually one of the areas where countries that are not manufacturers of equipment, they will find gains in jobs. So back to the comments by Gary, this thing about the mercantilism and the industrial policy sort of mind that has informed these exchanges. It usually leaves aside services, as you know. Sherry's done a great deal of work on this, and so they don't estimate usually I mean, the people that come up with these arguments don't estimate usually the gains in the services sector. They only look at the manufacturing sector. And in the case of renewable energies, you have a very interesting case for, again, to go deeper into that understanding and trying to bring those numbers out. We've been talking to Rick about doing some econometric analysis, some modeling of those sort of gains. And I think that should probably be a next step in this project as well, because there's a lot of, there's a big gap there in research and knowledge. Then on the non-tariff barriers, a bit of the same. Now there's in this sector there are many non-tariff barriers that are that have emerged that are difficult to capture and codified and then try to manage through this kind of negotiations. And this morning we were just discussing, for instance, in the case of say in Europe, in France, you have requirements on the installation of solar panels that would only admit that if you install a solar panel in your house, it has to be integrated with the roof. But if you're in the Netherlands, the solar panel can go on the roof. The Chinese manufacturers, they cannot really make yet those solar panels that go in the roof, but they make the other types. But the French manufacturers are experts on the ones that go in the roof. Okay, those kind of regulations become non-tariff barriers, and then the question again is how do you harmonize regulations so that you take away the inefficiencies and the advantages that are being better. But I think again, this is where we need some more work to try to come up with very specific forms of expressing those type of measures in a way that then can be negotiated away. But maybe if I may, Rick, I may ask Mahesh from my team, who's been doing a lot work on services in this area, to just expand a little bit on, if you want, on this reaction. Mahesh.
Thank you, Ricardo. I think, yes, the point that Gary mentioned also about the fact that there's a lot of overlap between services on climate-friendly, on sustainable energy and the engineering and procurement side. Now, the issue is that countries can always clarify what those services are, and they need to commit only liberalization in those specific services. But the fact is, the very fact that there is ambiguity in the classification means that as a first step for the SETA, it would be good to start on that clarification process initially and then go into the liberalization mode, because I think we really would need to be clear about what services exactly is it that we would like to liberalize or not. I don't know if I missed anything. But.
Okay.
I just offer one thought on China, which is, stepping aside from the mechanics of the negotiations of all this stuff, that well, obviously, in that countervailing case, what's at issue is not about tariffs. Obviously, it's about domestic content supports, and China won't even, is not acknowledging that they've been doing that in a major way, and they point to the fact that the U.S. does the same, which is fair and accurate. It could be, and this is an outside chance, but I just float this as an idea, it could be that the market is becoming so over capacity in that particular sector, and we are seeing Chinese companies that are hurt by this, that Chinese officials aren't necessarily in the mood to provide a lot more of domestic content subsidies anyway, because they've spent that money and because they've also built up a very powerful position in terms of exports and manufacturing. I'm just talking about photovoltaics. They're trying in wind as well. And it may be that they just don't actually want to spend a whole lot more money on these supports, and thus they could come back to the international negotiations and say, listen, we think this international trade agreement idea is a terrific one, and we're willing to walk away from any further supports in this regard. And meanwhile, what's happened is the horse has long since left the gate. The supports and the kind of supports that they provided to their wind industry 3-4 years ago have already done exactly what they were intended to do, which was to build a strong domestic manufacturing base there that in the case of solar exports in a big way, in the case of wind is close to being able to export potentially in a big way. And they could just say, okay, we're done and we want free trade. And frankly, it would be consistent with their domestic policy desires anyway.
Okay, let's take another round of questions or comments. Yes, sir.
In the first presentation of Ethan, it was shown that some of the regions that are growing rapidly are Asia and Africa. And what do you see in Asia and Africa in terms of trade barriers within Asia and between Asia and Africa? Are those large, or there's something smaller that we don't need to worry much? Because if we look at the future, that's where we want large investment on renewable energy being deployed. Thanks.
I would just add, from a political economy perspective on the solar challenge against China, I'm on the board of Vote Solar, and the conversation among the solar industry on this, there's a significant segment that's actually opposing the challenge against China on this, really feeling like that goes against, from a political economy perspective, their case that we're affordable, we can compete, we don't need to fight these challenges at this point. So going forward, I would agree with Ethan on the importance of it, or lack thereof.
Yes, a question for Gary about the timeline he sees in terms of possibly having an agreement on reducing tariffs for goods. Would it be enough time to perhaps have agreement on at least definitions of services? Because you went from a more than 400 tariff line to 39, so it's a very modest start. Do you envision doing something also very, very modest on services? My concern that, temporary things become permanent. So you do, tariff barriers, and, services are just forgotten. Even if you just put your foot into the door, I think it's worth a thought. And secondly, on ethanol, including in the list, if you could just give us your thoughts on how you see the politics, the pros and cons of this playing out. As you know, it's not the same to have, sugarcane-based ethanol rather than corn-based, with a whole host of subsidies that are supposed to be phasing out, but who knows? So if you could just spell out the politics of including ethanol, I'd appreciate it.
All right, let's stop and get reactions. That last question probably could take a half hour in and of itself to respond to, but.
Well, I'd like to suggest that we defer the ethanol question until Amy Porges speaks, because she's an expert on that and will inform us on the politics. So on the timeline, yeah, that's a good point, Antonio. Maybe we could get a refined list of services which, it's a generalized service, some kind of engineering or consulting, but specifically devoted to renewable, and, as you say, get a foot in the door. It must be very frustrating to the people trying to negotiate this, but I would think that the best chance of getting a refined list for SETA would be if the parties to a SETA agreement would yield to an impartial third party, such as the World Bank or someone, to identify a list, because the negotiating process for reaching lists apparently did not work. So I would, maybe on that basis, we could get a few services within the agreement.
Just briefly on services, there is, as you remember, Antonio, the W120 reference list that is used in the services in the GATS comes from an early iteration of the CPC classification, and so that has moved forward. And now in CPC2, you have some of these services already organized and classified. And so I wouldn't think that it's that difficult to jump into sort of that stage. Again, the advantages of something like a SETA is that you get away from the rigidities and the immobility sometimes that you find in the multilateral process. So this is one of those, I think, one of those areas where SETA can show some way forward by then having a fresh new look at services. And even if it does it in a very specific context, then that would, in the future, perhaps inform also the multilateral process. Then on Africa and China, I quite didn't get the question, but your question was whether Africa and Asia, so South-South trade. Yeah, I think one of the things that I think we all understand here is that the technologies that we now have for renewable energies are at the 2011 stage, if you like, right? So I just put it like that. But there's a good deal of R&D going on There's some criticism on whether there's enough or not, particularly here in the U.S. And I think that any of these agreements have to think about the dynamism in technological development and innovation there. So I think that the Brazilians, for instance, when we have been discussing some of these issues with some of them informally, have always made that point, that with the current technologies, they're not sure that they could participate in this way or that, but that they are putting their bets on very fast technological development in this area. And so I think that goes to a great extent to what we may see in Africa. Now in Africa, if you look at demographics and you look at prospects for, again, deployment of renewable energy, what you have is an incredibly rich market coming up in a few years' time. So I think that that market itself will probably be an attraction to investment and then to further development of those technologies.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo that. I mean, when I think of the sort of regions of the world where domestic content policies are most prevalent, it's probably not Asia and Africa that it first comes to mind. It's other parts of the world. It's more about Latin America, certainly Brazil, actually, because that you can't really finance a project in Brazil unless you comply with with local content requirements. The one exception maybe in Asia is India, which has this India Solar Mission initiative and has specific requirements for domestic content manufacturing of photovoltaics. India also has some, from what I understand, fairly arcane standards required for, that need to be complied with for wind turbine technology, which has effectively helped defend the home team there, which is a company called Suzlon, and a big manufacturer as well. So India might single out as a little bit worse than some of the other Asian countries, but mostly for Africa, at least I haven't seen too much of it yet.
Let me ask a question myself here, and this particularly goes to you, Ricardo. And this it's on the topic of how broad or narrow the goods list would be. Gary and his colleague have thrown out a proposition for a relatively narrowly constructed list at the 6-digit level. Your prior mapping work tried to disaggregate things down to a finer level of detail, and you did so, I thought, properly in the service of attempting to look at this as an exercise not just to facilitate finished goods trade, but to encourage a more efficient investment flows and to optimize supply chains, because that's basically the way big complex pieces of equipment are produced these days around the world. So could you comment a bit on the suggested, initial at least, suggestion for a relatively narrow high-level list versus in the context of the work you did earlier? And maybe, Gary, perhaps we get a little colloquy going between the two of you on this.
Well, thank you. Well, I think this is one of the probably most difficult issues on where to start, and there are probably positive aspects to go in a broader take and look at the disaggregation, look at components, and so on. It also, in a way, reflects the kind of 21st century production networks and trade that we have in the world now. As I said before, that sort of perspective would provide a better view of opportunities to countries that are at lower levels of development, and opportunities to participate in these whole markets. And we have already seen it in the discussions in the WTO on environmental goods and services. So when they discuss at 2-4 levels, many countries feel excluded, but when you start then broadening the scope, then countries immediately find an interest. The biggest challenge is the dual use question there. So you come up with these very broad lists, and they may include, say, a pipe, a steel pipe, and so that you can use for many other purposes than putting together a renewable energy piece of equipment. So is this a backdoor to liberalizing goods in a broader sense than just renewables? And I think that there's that's sort of an assessment that countries have to make by themselves, and then go. My guess is that in an ideal world, you would sort of throw on the table a very broad list, and then countries would start negotiating down to what is possible and desirable. But again, from the perspective of this it might sound theoretical, but the clarity of purpose kind of thrust that I like to give to this kind of ideas, you would probably don't be that concerned about double use, right? So if what you're trying to do is foster deployment of renewable energies and participation in those supply chains and so on, so what the hell if this includes some goods that are double use, right? And again, so this is why sometimes when I think of how do you really push the agreement forward, I think that with a very strong motivation on the mitigation perspective, you may be better off than with a mercantilist economic interest type of motivation to move the agreement forward. Now, the reduced list is very attractive for the same reasons. I mean, that it obviously minimizes these kind of difficulties. And so I think that the work that Gary has done and the proposal he's put together probably sounds as something that is ready to for some people to get on board, and that would probably be easier to it would be easier to find traction, particularly within a trade community. You know, it is a trade economic interest, more perspective, more sort of kind of perspective in a way. And so I know that I'm not giving you a definite answer on which is the best way to go, but it's that there are very good merits on going this way or the other. Now, Gary said at the end that one of the possibilities is to embed these sort of agreements into other processes. Already the U.S. Is expected to be pushing at the Hawaii meeting of APEC something of this sort. I haven't looked at the specifics, and it would be great to hear from someone that knows the specifics there. But that embeddedness would probably be more possible again in the type of very narrow, more narrow, very defined scope that Gary is proposing.
Quickly, let me give you 4 reasons for going narrow. One is the WTO failure in going broad. Secondly is the precedent we've now had of the TPP, because when you look at the trade coverage of that as currently conceived from a U.S. standpoint, it is minuscule. It's all about going for a template. The trade coverage for the U.S. Is only about 5 to 7%, so it's really truly small. But the payoff, as Peter Petrie points out in his very good paper presented here a little bit ago, is to establish a template for broadening, and that's the second reason. The third reason is that if you go broader and then you try to identify by a label that it's steel pipe for renewable energy, you get into a tracing issue when steel pipe is diverted. And then that leads to corruption. Anybody who knows textile trade knows that issue. And that then leads to, or the CDM mechanisms had the same problem. That leads to, a backlash against the agreement itself. Now, I do think you can have a tracing label for services because they're delivered here and now, but tracing for steel pipe, which lasts for 20 years or longer, that's pretty hard, and I don't think it's very successful. And my fourth reason for going narrow is in conjunction with a point I mentioned, the expansion clause. It would be very important for SETA not to have an expansion clause which required consensus. That's a killer, as we again see from the WTO. I think it should require a supermajority, maybe 60%, 75% of trade in the items in question, but with that qualification, you can add new items and you can add new subjects, and I would say the first subject would be local content requirement. And if there's some country which is a member of the agreement doesn't like the expansion, well, it can bail out of the agreement totally. So easy exit, but with easy expansion.
Just a question in general. Anybody be able to give us some historical perspective on the ITA's experience in this respect? The level of coverage.
Oh yeah, that was 90%, or very close to 90. But the difference, well, maybe it isn't a difference here. There were about 5 companies, and IBM was a leader, who produced all this stuff. So it was relatively easy to negotiate because the number of companies who were producers in all the countries was quite small, and they were really reducing the tariffs that they charge from one part of the company to another. That isn't quite the renewable energy story, but the renewable energy story maybe has parts of that.
But in terms of the product lines.
Well, they got the initial product line, yes, but then when you get to the fuzzy areas, you get the Europeans trying to bail out. As you know, and we have a case. I think we'll prevail. I think maybe we have prevailed against Europeans.
Actually, I have, yes, I think USTR ran the numbers obsessively, looked very carefully at what the critical mass would be, and bargained hard about these dual use issues. Because in fact, the dual use issue has plagued this kind of agreement going back to the 50s. The first GATT agreement on trade and environment was actually an agreement back in the 50s to try and liberalize trade in environmental goods, which were at that time defined as DDT. Okay, DDT and pesticides beneficial to man. I'm not kidding, but a question to you, Gary. Have you run the numbers on different sort of wider and narrower definitions for this agreement, and have you tried to see where you could get a really high critical mass with a low number of countries?
We haven't, but that's a good idea.
I think in the interest of keeping us reasonably on schedule, we ought to move to the next set of presentations.